Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time we are going to be extending the biome-based procedural generation, and in particular the Unity terrain-based version of that. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding in support for the detail system. So the detail system in the terrain is used for painting on things like grass or sort of small shrubs, little bushes being scattered around. So we're going to set up support for that in the terrain generation. So let's dive on in. Now, in terms of with setting this up, the majority of the work we actually are going to need to do is actually for wrangling the detail configuration on the terrain. So similar to what we previously had to do with the terrain, where there was extra work we had to do for setting up these terrain layers, a similar process is going to need to happen for these details. It's a little bit different in that we don't need to create any extra assets that get saved out for doing that. So that does simplify that process a little bit. But there are going to be a few things that we do need to get set up for it. The actual process of doing the painting is going to actually be the quickest and simplest part of this. Most of it is actually going to be down to the maintaining and building up of that data. So a crucial thing when we're setting up something like this is thinking about, okay, well, where do we want the data to fit in? And if we take a bit of a look at how we currently have things configured, then what we have is each biome has these different sort of modifiers that can be configured. And we've split them out because we apply them in different orders. And if we think about something like painting and grass and that, it makes sense for that to actually be quite late in the process because we want height information. We potentially want to be able to look at texture information. We also could be looking at things like any other objects that are already placed so we can be filtering them out. So that's what I'm going to use as a bit of my basis for this. I'm actually going to have that detail painting as a separate modifier. So we're going to call this our detail painter. So, okay, we'll have a detail painter. That'll be a thing we need to apply. So we want to now inject this into the process. So we've got some of that side of things happening. And largely how we're going to work with this is I'm going to add in stuff intentionally causing things to break at points. So that's sort of my general approach when I'm going and actually extending things, is I will intentionally cause stuff to break. The reason being is that it's a great way to actually find the potential issues. So we've got our main generation function, which between the last video and this one, there's a couple of little improvements I've made with managing the stages here. The reason being it just makes it a little bit cleaner to work with. And if we take a look at the stages, more conveniently, I'm going to add in one here called detail painting. And then we can go back down to our function and we can see the different stages that are happening here. So we've done object placement. So right after this is actually where I will do the detail painting. So I'm going to say that this is detail painting. And then we paint the details. So we're going to perform detail painting. Now passing in the map resolution and the alpha map one makes sense. We would be using both of those potentially. There's a couple of other things I actually want to grab out of this though. One of the ones is the detail map resolution. Because details do have a separate resolution that we can configure. So we actually do need to make sure we've got that detail resolution. The other thing is the detail maps actually work a little differently to, for example, the texture ones. So the alpha map for the textures, we paint in a 0 to 1 value that indicates the intensity, whereas the detail map is actually a integer. We give it a number. So we need to know what the maximum value there is, which the max detail patches, or max detail items is the target terrain and the detail resolution per patch. So I want to pass those into this function. So our detail map resolution and our max detail items. Max details per patch. So I'll actually rename it to that. So this is going to be the main function that will perform that painting. So, okay, we can go down to where we're doing our object placement. So we'll just keep things in order. And I will set up my perform generation. And this was going to be our detail painting. Which is paint details, I believe I called it. And it's going to take in our map and alpha map resolution. And if we remember, it's also going to have our detail map resolution and our max details per patch. So that looks good. We'll just make sure we've matched the name correctly here. So perform detail painting. So, okay, good so far. It actually, in terms of the process for how it applies, is going to be most similar to the terrain painting. So I'm actually going to bring over the terrain painting one. The reason being is that a lot of the stuff is actually going to be quite similar in terms of what it ends up doing. Now, we don't need to have the stuff for zeroing out the layers. We can see, okay, it's going to do the painting for each biome. That is largely looking good. We need our base painter though, so that's something where I'm going to set up here detail painters, and I'm going to create a base detail painter, just so we've got it that we can refer to. And we will be getting compile errors at the moment, but that's fine. I just want that script to exist so I can get here and go base detail painter. I want to be able to retrieve that. The biome has a detail painter. So we retrieve those. Execute, I won't fix up just yet, but we will shortly. This post-processing, I could see there being use in having post-processing support for the details. We might want to do some blending, some thinning out, some variations there. So I think good to support that. This obviously needs to change because that's for texturing. So I'm going to have one here. Terrain, or we'll call it detail painting. That way we've got the option of doing the post-processing support for it if we decide that it's a thing that we want to support. But I think it is actually a useful thing to support. So, okay. So far so good. We do have a whole bunch of errors. That's okay. We kind of are wanting those errors at the moment. We need to now, at the moment, we're retrieving and setting the alpha maps, which obviously we're not going to change that. We want to actually look at how do we get those detail maps. So if I go target terrain, terrain data, get detail layer. Now what we'll notice with this is it does support those same inputs we expect of the coordinates and the range, but it also wants us to provide the actual layer index. and it just returns a 2D array. So we actually, with this, we can't, unlike with the alpha maps where we get an array, we get the whole stack of them, we don't actually get that with the terrain details. We have to go and actually manually construct that. So what I'm going to do, just because it actually ends up being kind of the cleanest and neatest way to set it up, I'm going to create a map here. So this will be detail layer maps. That is a new set of our list. I can find out how many we have because that's going to be in our detail prototypes.length, which I will bring this out as a separate variable. So num detail layers. We have that. Then what I would do is loop through all of those. So layer index, just so we can go and retrieve all of those. So it ends up being a little bit convoluted, as each of the systems within the terrain actually all kind of works slightly differently, which does make it a little bit at times a bit messier. So what I would do is detail layer maps, add, and then we add that in. So this lets us retrieve current detail layers. And then for setting those back, I can just grab this, apply the detail layers. So rather than doing a get, what we will actually end up doing is we have a set detail layer. Now with the set, we don't need to provide the resolution, but what we do need to do is provide the data. That's good. That will go and apply the data. So our function here is largely complete. The execute is obviously not working yet. And it makes sense with this. We're passing through height map, slope information, the alpha maps. I am then going to add in detail layer maps. We want the detail map resolution and the max details per patch. Just so we've got the full set of all the info that we need. This is giving us our sense of what the execute function will look like. Because we created our base detail painter, but we haven't actually gone and configured this. Now this is going to look fairly similar in many ways to one for the terrain texturing. So if I go and take a look at what the terrain one looks like, so the base one for it, so we have our base texture painter. So we'll come back to the texture config. It's this strength and execute function. We'll bring that over because being able to control the strength of it, that's a good global control to have. And then we just need to add in, we added our things in after the alpha maps. So we will have a list of our 2D array. That will be our detail layer maps. We'll have our detail map resolution and our max details per patch. So that looks good. We should see that it's then happy. I will move that script because it was created in a different folder. So now I need to reopen our base detail painter just because we did move that. So far, that's actually working. So with what we have now, it would try and run the generation. Obviously, we need to be able to configure the data for it. Now, I mentioned that the data gets configured similar to the terrain layers. And if we go and take a look at the specific stuff for the details, when we go to edit details, we can add either a mesh where we configure a few different things, or we can add in a grass texture, so it'll be a billboarded texture. So we need to support both of those types of things, and we need to support a few different things in terms of how we configure these. So what I'm going to do is similar to what we did with the texture where we had this texture config. I'm going to set up here a system serializable, and this is going to be our terrain detail config. And what we're going to have is we're going to have, okay, a configuration for a grass billboard. So I'll have all of the settings that we could have for that. So a grass billboard. So what we'll have is a texture 2D. And this will be the billboard texture. Now, similar to what the configuration for a grass one had, we want to be able to configure this healthy and dry color. So we'll have color, healthy color. Now, the values I'm about to put in here are going to seem quite random and arbitrary. They are actually based upon the default ones that Unity uses for it. So just from a point of view of consistency, the reason that's why I'm actually using the same defaults that Unity does. Because if someone's going and configuring this and they're already familiar with the terrain system, we're starting from a point that they expect. So it just makes it a little bit more user-friendly for folks working with it. So just set up this one. And these give us pretty decent starting colors for this as well, so it works quite nicely. So that's almost all of these set up. So that's the essential things we need for a grass billboard. We also support meshes because we want to be able to support putting in like a bush, something like of that. Obviously those do get a lot more expensive. So we do want to be cautious with how much we use those, but those are something that is supported. Now those have just a prefab that we need to provide. And then we get to the common settings. So there's a bunch of common ones that all of these support. So the main ones that we've got there are we have a min width. We also have a max width of 2. And again, I'm sticking with the same defaults that Unity uses, just to make it a little bit easier. And also means the results, we know what to expect. We also have noise configurations and the spread. So we're just trying to match as best as possible all of the settings that Unity would be exposing there, including the ranges. Now we could do a custom inspector for this to make that a little bit easier to work with, but this will get us to a good point. So that's good. So these terrain detail configs are how on a particular modifier we will control what prototype, detail prototype they're referred to as gets set up. But we only want to set up the ones that we need, because one of the reasons we're going via the detail system is it has a lot of things to try and improve performance. We kind of ruin that if we use the same thing with the exact same configuration in multiple biomes, but it gets treated as different. So we want it to be able to actually detect that ones are the same and group them together. That's what we do with the terrain texture layers. We only have the unique ones, and that's why we added in this support for being able to retrieve those textures. So we actually want to be able to do a similar thing with our detail painter. So I am going to set up here that interface. So retrieve terrain details. And this will be terrain detail config. And this is where we want to go and find anywhere where retrieve textures is being run. So we can find the references, because that's going to let us know what are areas that we need to go and update. And we can see our biome has a retrieve textures function. So we want to change this so that what it's able to do is we also have a terrain detail config, and we're going to match the name again so we're consistent. So we have our detail painter. These we can come through and update so that it's using the correct types. These are our base detail painters. And we make sure that it's using the correct particular one. We're retrieving the terrain details. So we just go through, update each individual one. And we'll follow this process through just to find all of the areas where we need to go and update. So we have seen, if we look at the references, so find references is super handy for tracking stuff like this down. Both of the references that we had, we've got one here that we've gone and updated. And if we take a look, we also have this generate texture mapping function, which we can see is also talking to the biomes-based one. So we're actually going to need a version of this generate texture mapping for the detail prototypes. Because what this does is this finds all of the textures, generates a unique list of them, so it only creates the ones that we need. That's exactly the kind of process we need, except for the terrain details. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use that function as a basis. And we're going to now break it. So this is generating the terrain detail mapping. And so initially, I'm just going to go and update all of the types that I know I need to. So anywhere where I add texture config, I know that changes. So I just want to break lots of the bits. The base texture painter, I know that's going to need to be the detail painter. And again, just trying to break these things so I get lots of compile errors, because I've copied and pasted code, always something where there's a potential for errors being introduced. So the easiest way to make sure that we don't miss anything is we'll then go and intentionally break some key points. So data types, things like that, are a good one to break. So here, well, this is a mapping that goes from a texture to the layer index. It would make sense that we would have a biome terrain detail to detail layer index. So we'll go with that as the naming of it. So it's going to be able to map from a terrain detail to the layer index. So anywhere we're referring to that, we would want to go and update it. Again, this is going to break a whole bunch of things. That's intentionally what we're trying to do with this. So now, terrain details. I can do a rename on this one. All terrain details. Now biome, well, we know we're not retrieving the textures, we're retrieving terrain details. Can rename biome textures here. So biome terrain details. Apply that. So far so good. We're retrieving all of them. We're putting them all into the list. This will have a lot of duplicates. Now the painting post-processing modifier, it's actually the detail painting one. So we need to make sure we update that. We extract again all of the terrain details. So we retrieve those. We can again do a rename. These are our terrain details. We filter out the duplicate entries the same as before. We iterate over all of the terrain detail configurations. And we store that. So that's our terrain detail. So now we've got that filtering process happening. We'll obviously need to set up our dictionary here. It's going to be terrain detail config and init. And same process we follow for initializing. So at this point, we should check if we've got any errors because we did change a whole bunch of things. So we can see, okay, the painter here doesn't have an entry for that, and that's because, most common error, we forgot to save. So I want to set reload, so that's good. So we know it's got that generation function now, so we've got that generating the terrain detail mapping. But we need to make sure that gets called similar scenarios to when we do the generate texture mapping. So again, we can find all our references. We want to see the cases where we're doing that. So we can see here we generate the texture mapping. We should make sure we also generate the detail mapping. So we can add in a new entry for that. Build detail map. Can go back down to here and we do the same process, just making sure that we have the detail map. Let's build detail map. And so we change this over. This is now our perform, and we generate the terrain detail mapping. So that's good. So that was one of the references, so we can see that's up to date. Now if we take a look at the other scenario, this is this perform layer setup, which if we remember and look at the ProcGen manager, we had this regenerating the texture layers. So we actually want to have a similar setup for the detail prototypes. So I'm going to set up a similar thing. Now it will be fairly different in terms of the logic here, just because of how it works, but I want to have the same sort of interfaces. So I'm going to create up here a public void regenerate detail prototypes. And that's going to perform detail prototype setup. And its actual logic is going to be quite a bit different. The general structure is going to be similar, but how it actually works is quite different, just because how the actual detail prototypes work is quite different. Now this function gets called from here. So we have our little button. So we're going to update that. Regenerate detail prototypes. So all of this is to set up the detail prototype information. As I said, the majority of what we need to be doing for this is actually the setup side of things. It's all pretty much down to just doing that setup side. So now that we've got that going, we actually can do the main part of it in terms of that setup side, which is the creation of these particular prototypes. So what we need to do is, first thing we do is we generate that dictionary. We get that unique set of all of the detailed prototypes. Then we have to go and actually create those entries. So we're going to need detailed prototypes, and that is going to be a new detail prototype where the size of that is based upon the number of entries. So we've created it. The actual population of it, so the setting of it in the inspector is actually pretty straightforward. Firstly, we'll do a record object because we want to make sure that we're tracking those changes. And we'll just indicate that, okay, updating detail prototypes. Setting them, really easy. We go for our target terrain, fix up our typo. So our target terrain data, detail prototypes is that new one we've created. And there is also, unlike with the textures, there is actually a refresh function that we should run whenever we make changes. Well, this will be update the detail prototypes. So now we can build our list, build the list of detail prototypes. So what happens is we need to go through that dictionary and turn that into an array and also do the actual conversion of the data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over this using the key value pair setup. So I can have layer index. So we put it in the right spot so we actually pick the correct thing. That's the value. And then we have our terrain detail config. And this is the detail data. And that's from the key. So I can now create the particular prototype, which it's called a detail prototype. New detail. I then store it at the end. So we'll have detail prototypes. Their index is a new detail. We also support validating these. So I'm going to put a message, pick the prototype, and we can go if new detail, in this case we do a not, and we do a validate with providing it the error message. That way, if something's wrong with it, it will actually pick up errors. Now, an important thing that I have run into with this, the validate does not seem to catch all cases. I have logged a bug with Unity about this. It doesn't seem to catch all cases, and if a prototype is not valid and validate doesn't pick up on that, when you go and assign it, you can get an immediate crash with Unity. So if you do encounter that, please do chuck in a comment below indicating the Unity version that you are using, and if possible, any extra details that you might have there of the particular configuration, because that's then further information that I can be passing on to Unity, hopefully, and can get that validate function sorted. For now, I'm going to throw a new, and we'll go invalid operation, and we'll just provide the error message. So, okay, we can configure the detail prototype now. Now, this is something where what we configure, there's going to be a bunch of common things. So, our common ones, if we remember, were, if we go back over to the base detail painter, these ones here were all of our common ones. So min width, max width, min height, max height, all of those were the common ones. So those, we'll set those to begin with, because those are ones that we know are going to always be there. So we have our min, these will be our max. And we have the same thing for, that's actually goes to be height. I'll update these. So that transfers over those common ones. We also have, remember, our particular noise ones. So we had the noise seed and the spread. Autocomplete is helping out quite nicely, which is handy. So in this case, our noise spread. So we bring that over. And yeah, the final one then was the common setting there for with the whole edge padding. That's common ones. So we transfer the common data. Then which ones we actually bring over, or what things we set, are going to be based upon the whether it's a mesh or whether it is a billboard. So I'm going to check first. Okay, well if if our detailed data actually has a prefab. So is this a mesh? If it is, then we have new detail, and it's the prototype gets set to the detailed data prefab. We also want to change the render mode. So I'm going to go for vertex lit. We also want to set, okay, use prototype mesh is true because we're providing a mesh. I want to also tell it instancing gets turned on. So that's good. We then, otherwise, we're using a billboard. So in that case, we need to provide the texture and our render mode needs to be set to, in this case, grass billboard. The using of instancing, actually one that we turn off. This is one that I found if instancing is turned on will actually cause a crash if it's for something like a billboard texture. So that was one of the crashes that I ran into. And just on the safe side, I'm going to set prototype mesh to false. So that will actually do it. That will generate that set of prototypes. So that's looking good. Now I would make sure I have everything saved to regenerate detailed prototypes, and as expected, nothing should really happen because we haven't actually set up our painter yet. But we are now in a position where we can. As I said, most of the setup stuff that we needed to do with this is actually that low-level infrastructure side. Now we can actually focus on setting up the painter. There is one final thing we have to do before we do that, just because we need it to be able to compare these easily. So it needs to support equality checks. Easiest way to do that if you're in Visual Studio, so you can right-click on it, and under Quick Actions and Refactoring, we can generate an equals and a get hash code. I don't need to generate the operators, but I include all of the variables that uniquely define this. That way, it goes and generates all of the code for me, so I can reliably assume that's going to be able to do those comparisons, which is really handy. If you are using a different IDE that doesn't generate those, the code is available up on GitHub, so if you want, you can just go and grab that code quickly now, throw that in. That's going to make it a lot easier. Or you can also use it as a bit of a reference point if you're wanting to set the things up yourself. But it keeps it just a little bit cleaner using the auto generation. but I can actually set up our painter now. So I am going to create a detail painter and random. Now I will go for similar to what we did with the terrain texturing. So we'll also have a detail painter based on slope and also one based on height. Now I'll focus only on implementing the random one because that illustrates the key things we need. But in the code that I upload, I will actually include the ones for painting based upon slope and height. I won't focus on running through those in this just because there's very little that's actually sort of different with them. They're quite similar. So, okay, our random is the one we want to set up. It's going to be based on base detail painter. And I'm going to actually use our terrain one for random as the basis because it's a pretty solid format for the structure and it's quite similar in how we're doing that. So first thing is random detail painter config. And that will have a detail to paint. That'll be a terrain detail config. And the actual structure of a lot of this is going to be the same. We're going to have that execute function. We're going to have this function to retrieve those configs. So I'm just actually going to use that as a starting point. This will be our random detail painter config. What I would do is I would bring over then the syntax for our execute function, because that will highlight any issues. And same thing for the retrieve terrain details. Again, I'm copying and pasting, but I'm trying to use the compiler to make my life easier, to try and find the particular ones that are a problem. So we'll update this terrain details one first. And we can see the particular things we're retrieving. We don't have the base texture. What we do have is that is going to be cached terrain details, just so we're not retrieving it all of the time. And we need to obviously mark these as override. Now, in terms of the actual painting, well, we don't have this base texture side of things. That's something we only needed for the process with the painting of textures. And we know we're not looping over alpha map resolution, it's detail map resolution. So again, we can go and make these changes. And we'll see very little changes. We don't change the alpha maps, it's actually the detail layer maps. And because of how that works, we'll change that to layer. We need to have our get detail layer. So it doesn't always auto-complete. Now we might actually not even have our get layer function. So we can go and check. So we need our conversion here. So we want a public int get detail layer for terrain detail. We provide our terrain detail config. And we do the exact same thing. This is where that mapping comes in. So that gives us back the index. That looks good. This becomes get our detail layer for that. And then the final bit, I said not much changes. This was generating a 0 to 1, but it needs to be an integer. Now we've already got it as a 0 to 1, so if we multiply it by the max details per patch, this actually just becomes then a floor to int. Like that. And that's enough to have our detail painter. That should mean we can actually go and set up our actual ones here. So I'm going to create our folder for our detail painters. And we do the same process of creating a empty prefab. So this is our detail painter, and let's go for in the bush area. I can add in detail painter random. And our configs, I want to go and add one in here and a detail to paint. Now one of the things we'll notice is, see how this is not properly initialized. It's actually a really easy way to fix that if we want. And what we do is we go to our random detail painter, and this here, we change that to being a new, and we actually give it an initial one. What we'll find then is it will actually properly run the initialization. So if I reset this, now it's got the colors in. So just a handy little trick if you do need to have this for sort of custom serialized ones. Doing that entry of just a new is going to then mean it will properly have those initialized. So I am going to select the very, very basic grass texture I made. We're going to, let's give it a noise scale of that. We'll pick a threshold. So that'll paint in a grass billboard. I also have set up a bush. And I'll clear that. That can use largely the same settings, but I'll change the noise scale. But that will do it. I can link that up to, if I go to our biome configuration, so this was for bush, the detail painter, link that up. So the only things I need to make sure I do is first I need to regenerate the detail prototypes. And again, I'm going to make sure I save first, just because, as I said, this is the area where I did find there was that crash in Unity. So we'll run it. No errors. If I look at the terrain, it's added in our prototypes, which now means if I go and regenerate the world, it's going to go through, it's finishing all of the different steps for it. So there's obviously quite a few steps. Do at times from the terrain tools, it will chuck up an error, that's okay. But now it's finished, and then if I go and find the appropriate area where there's bush, you can see that it's being generated. So that's great. We've got our generation, adding in these bushes, things like of that. I could now go and set up some other detail painters. So, okay, let's create a duplicate of that. And this is going to be for, we'll say it's for the grassy plains. We'll go and use this one. So grassy plains. So grassy plains, I will not have it place the mesh, and I will actually change the colors of these a little bit. So it's a little bit sort of drier looking. So I'll regenerate the detail prototypes, and if I go and look at the terrain, still got the only two there, and the reason for that is we need to remember and link these up. So the detail painter as the correct one. If I regenerate the prototypes now and take a look at the terrain, you can see we've now got 3 ones in there. And if I regenerate the world, we'll actually see the grassy plains will now have the grass patches in there, and they should be the slightly different coloration that we expect there for that, which is really handy. So we've got that generated, and we can see in the grassy areas things that are a different color. So we've got our biome generation working quite nicely. So as I said, I will set up the entries where we've got the different generators here for our height and slope, I will just throw those ones in. There's not anything that's very different on them other than to support the detail prototypes. So those will be ones you can just go and grab from the repo if you need. So through the magic of editing, we do now have the additional painters in here for slope and so forth. So what I'm going to do is modify our rainforest one. We're going to add in our height-based one. Actually, no, I'll use slope. We're going to add in our slope-based one. We're going to have that use our default grass, and I'm going to change the colors of it. Let's go for kind of a real mix of colors. And we'll have it just a basic scaling with slope. So that's our one for rainforest, so we can link that up. So our detail painter rainforest. We can just regenerate our detail prototypes. We should now see that we have 4 of them. And we can also see if we go and edit these, the actual particular setup for those. And one of the things we do spot is we need to make sure we transfer over the colors, because that is one that we actually forgot to transfer over when we're doing that layer setup. So when we're creating these prototypes, we need to make sure we bring over color. So new detail, the color, detail data, and we'll do the same thing for the dry color, just so that's brought over. And then if we regenerate that, regenerated those, now let's rebuild the world. And we should have quite the mix of different grass textures and things like of that being scattered around, which is going to be fantastic. So it's obviously going to take a little bit longer for generating because we've added more things into it. But we can see we've got our patches of darker grass in locations, and especially in those areas, which looks cool. So we've got our different ones working. We have our term now generating all of these different little sort of cool effects. There's our fancy looking grass that's the different weird colors. So that looks excellent. We can also, as a final thing, we should make sure we didn't break the runtime generation. So we can go tell it to regenerate. It's going to do its particular processes. So far nothing has visibly broken, which is good. It's going and doing its painting logic. We should then see that it goes through and eliminates all of the stuff with the actual sort of detail patches going in there. So runtime generation still working correctly, which is great. So that looks like we pretty much have everything up and running with this. One final thing we might want to go and check is just when we're going and doing the, so not the terrain painting, so that we do zero out everything. If we take a look at what we do for the detail painting, at the moment we grab the current detail layers, which is what we do for the object placement, but we should probably just reset all of them. So I'm going to do that just as a final thing, just to make sure we're not getting, stray old data in there. So what we will do is this is going to end up being a new int, and it is detail map resolution by detail map resolution. And this is actually going to be create a new empty set. just so we're not accidentally having stray data in there. And we'll just do a final test to make sure that that is still behaving correctly. Because we could have potentially, with how random works, we might have had some stray detail patches left. So it could be slowly pushing the amount of details over limits that we wanted to actually keep. So this will just erase all of that data to begin with. And we now have our detail patches. And that's working nicely. We can see it is a little bit thinner, so it was likely the case that it was sort of generating a little bit too much that was going in there. So dive on in and experiment with this. The modifiers so far are fairly straightforward in that they're random or slope or height, things like that, but you could easily have it be checking the particular textures that are there. So you could link from one texture, okay, this texture gets this particular type of grass there for it. So that's something that is an addition that could be added. But dive on in and experiment with it. See the kinds of things that you could add to it. See what sort of assets you might want to chuck in there for the grass. And see the kinds of cool, interesting looking terrains that you can create with it. Thanks folks, hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, chuck in a like and subscribe, it really helps out, it's really appreciated. If you're looking for the code for the project, the code is available up on GitHub, and I've put the link to that in the description below. You can freely use that code in any of your own projects, commercial or non-commercial ones. If you're trying to find other videos, then I do have a searchable video archive, and there is a link to that in the description. If you've got any questions, chuck in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, and there's also a link to that in the description below as well. But until next time, bye!